crowd began cheering before the gates even opened. Thousands of voices echoed across the stone walls of the arena, hungry for a spectacle that most citizens of the Roman world considered normal, but which, to modern eyes, would appear horrifying. Because on this day, the people of Rome were not gathering to watch gladiators fight or criminals face justice. They had come to watch women die, not quietly, not privately, but publicly in front of tens of thousands of spectators. What kind of society could transform the execution of women into entertainment? And how did an empire as advanced and influential as Rome reach a point where death itself became a performance? The truth is more complex and more disturbing than most people realize. To understand it, we must travel back nearly 2,000 years, to the beating heart of the Roman world. The city of Rome in the first centuries of the empire was a place of staggering power and wealth. Marble temples towered above busy streets. Markets overflowed with goods from across the Mediterranean. Ships arrived daily carrying grain from Egypt, spices from the east, and slaves captured from distant lands. At its height, the city held more than 1 million people. Senators in fine robes walked beside merchants, soldiers, philosophers, and beggars. It was a world where luxury and brutality existed side by side, and nowhere was that contrast more visible than inside the great arena known as the Colosseum. This massive structure could hold more than 50,000 spectators. Built during the reign of the Flavian emperors, it stood as a symbol of Roman engineering and imperial power. From the outside, it looked magnificent, arches stacked upon arches, rising into the Roman sky. But inside those walls, something darker unfolded. The Colosseum was designed for spectacle. The Romans loved entertainment, but their idea of entertainment was very different from ours. Gladiatorial battles, exotic animal hunts, mock naval battles, and public executions were all part of the grand games that emperors sponsored to keep the population entertained and loyal. These events were known as the ludi. And while gladiators were the stars of the arena, there were other performances that were even more disturbing. Among them were the executions of criminals. To Roman authorities, execution was not simply punishment. It was also a warning, a public demonstration of what happened to those who challenged the law, the gods, or the authority of the state. But over time, these executions began to evolve into something else entirely. They became theatrical. Actors, costumes, elaborate sets. Sometimes entire mythological stories were reenacted inside the arena. The condemned were forced to play roles in these deadly dramas, and occasionally, those condemned were women. Everything was about to change. Roman society placed strict expectations on women. Respectable Roman women were expected to live modest lives focused on family and household duties. Public honor was tied closely to reputation, modesty, and loyalty. But when a woman committed a serious crime, or was accused of one, those expectations could quickly turn into condemnation. Crimes such as murder, treason, adultery, religious offenses, or even participation in certain forbidden cults could lead to severe punishment. And sometimes, those punishments were designed not only to kill, but to humiliate. One of the most shocking forms of execution involved staging mythological scenes, where the condemned person was forced to reenact a tragic story from Roman legend. Imagine the arena filled with spectators, the sun beating down on the sand, musicians playing dramatic music, costumed performers acting out a famous myth, and at the center of it all a real person who knew they were about to die. One famous example involved the myth of Pasiphae. In Greek mythology, Pasiphae was cursed to fall in love with a bull. In Roman arena performances, condemned women were sometimes forced to play this role in grotesque reenactments. Ancient writers described these spectacles with disturbing detail. Crowds watched as animals were released into the arena, and the condemned woman became part of the performance. For the audience, it was shocking, thrilling, unforgettable. For the victim, it was terror beyond imagination. But these spectacles did not appear overnight. They were the result of centuries of cultural transformation. Roman entertainment culture had deep roots in earlier traditions of public punishment. Even in the early days of the Republic, criminals were sometimes executed in public spaces as warnings to others. But as Rome expanded and wealth flowed into the empire, public entertainment became increasingly elaborate. Emperors competed with one another to stage bigger, grander, more spectacular games. Because the games served an important political purpose, they distracted the population, they reinforced imperial power, and they reminded everyone watching who truly controlled life and death in the Roman world. One emperor in particular became famous for his extravagant spectacles: Nero. Nero ruled Rome during a period of intense political tension. His reign was marked by artistic ambition, paranoia, and dramatic public performances. According to ancient historians, Nero often used executions as part of theatrical displays. Condemned prisoners, men and women alike, were sometimes forced to participate in reenactments of famous myths where the story ended in death. In one such performance, a condemned woman playing the role of a mythological character might face wild animals released into the arena. The audience watched, horrified yet fascinated, but not everyone approved. Some Roman philosophers criticized these spectacles as signs of moral decay. They argued that turning suffering into entertainment corrupted the values of society. Among those critics was the Stoic philosopher Seneca the Younger, who wrote about the disturbing cruelty he witnessed in the arena. Seneca described how crowds became increasingly desensitized to violence. What once shocked them soon became ordinary. Spectators demanded greater and greater displays of brutality. Blood had become a form of entertainment, and the empire provided it. But perhaps the most disturbing element of these executions was the way they blurred the line between justice and spectacle. A condemned woman might enter the arena already sentenced to death, yet the manner of that death, its drama, its humiliation, its theatrical staging, was designed entirely for the pleasure of the crowd. In some cases, the condemned were accused of crimes that modern historians still debate: political rivals, religious minorities, slaves who had rebelled, or simply people who had fallen out of favor with powerful figures. Once condemned, their fate was sealed. The gates of the arena would open, and the performance would begin. But even as the crowds roared with excitement, something else was happening beneath the surface of Roman society. A slow shift in values. New ideas were spreading across the empire. Ideas about mercy, about compassion, about the value of human life. And eventually, those ideas would begin to challenge the brutal traditions of the arena itself. Because not everyone in Rome believed that executions should be entertainment. Some believed the games had gone too far. But the moment when the empire would finally begin to change was still many years away. For now, the arena remained a place where power was displayed through violence, where myth and reality collided in terrifying ways, and where the execution of women could become part of a grand public spectacle. The sand of the Colosseum had absorbed countless stories. Stories of courage, stories of suffering, and stories that the empire itself would eventually try to forget. But the truth about those spectacles still echoes through history. Because the arena did more than entertain Rome. It revealed the darkest side of an empire that ruled the ancient world. At dawn, the arena floor looked almost peaceful. The sand was freshly raked, the gates were closed, and the massive stone walls of the Colosseum cast long shadows across the empty seats. For a brief moment, before the crowds arrived, the amphitheater felt like a silent monument rather than a theater of death. But beneath the arena floor, deep in the dark corridors below, the condemned were already awake. Chains rattled softly in the underground chambers. Guards moved through the tunnels carrying torches. The smell of animals drifted through the stone passageways. Lions, bears, and leopards growled inside iron cages, unaware that they too would soon become part of the spectacle above. Among the prisoners waiting in those shadowed cells were women whose stories would never be recorded in full. Some had been convicted of serious crimes. Others had been accused of defying Roman authority, participating in forbidden religions, or simply angering powerful individuals. Whatever the reason, their fate was now tied to the arena. Above them, the city of Rome was waking. Thousands of citizens poured through the streets toward the amphitheater. Vendors set up stalls selling bread, olives, wine, and roasted meat. Children ran beside their parents, excited for the day's games. Senators arrived in elegant robes, escorted by attendants. Soldiers stood at the entrances to maintain order. For the Roman people, the games were more than entertainment. They were a ritual, a celebration of power, a reminder that the empire controlled life and death. When the gates of the amphitheater opened, the crowd surged inside. 50,000 people filled the vast structure, their voices echoing off the marble and stone. Flags snapped in the wind. Trumpets sounded across the arena. The spectacle had begun. The early part of the games usually featured animal hunts. Skilled hunters fought exotic creatures brought from distant lands, lions from Africa, bears from the mountains of Europe, and even elephants captured during Roman conquests. The crowd cheered as hunters demonstrated courage and skill against dangerous beasts. But the audience knew something else was coming: the executions. In Roman spectacles, executions were often scheduled for the midday interval, between the morning hunts and the afternoon gladiator battles. This part of the program was known for its cruelty. Because the condemned were not expected to survive, Sometimes the prisoners were simply thrown to wild animals in a punishment known as Damnatio ad Bestias, condemnation to the beasts. But in other cases, the executions were staged as elaborate performances based on mythological stories. And it was during these performances that women sometimes appeared in the arena. Ancient writers describe several shocking examples. One particularly disturbing account tells of a woman forced to reenact the myth of Dirce. In Greek legend, Dirce was tied to a wild bull and dragged to her death. In the Roman arena, condemned prisoners were sometimes forced to play this role in horrifying reenactments. The audience watched as actors dressed as mythological characters surrounded the condemned woman. Musicians played dramatic music. Then a wild animal was released into the arena. The story ended exactly as the myth described, but this time it was real. Another myth often reenacted in the arena involved the tragic story of Orpheus. In the legend, Orpheus was torn apart by wild animals after angering the gods. Roman organizers sometimes recreated this scene by forcing a condemned prisoner to play the role of Orpheus. When the animals were released, the audience watched the myth come to life. Except it was not a performance, it was an execution. The line between theater and reality had completely vanished. Everything was about to change. The Roman fascination with these spectacles was deeply tied to their understanding of justice and power. In the Roman worldview, punishment served multiple purposes. It eliminated criminals, discouraged rebellion, and reinforced the authority of the state. Public executions made that authority visible. When the crowd watched someone die in the arena, they were witnessing the ultimate power of Rome. And the emperor was always present in that display. Seated in a special box overlooking the arena, the emperor controlled the games. His gestures could decide the fate of gladiators. His approval signaled the start and end of performances. For many emperors, the games were a tool of political survival. Few understood this better than Commodus. Commodus ruled Rome in the late 2nd century and was obsessed with the arena. Unlike most emperors, he did not simply sponsor the games. He participated in them. Ancient sources describe how Commodus entered the arena dressed as a gladiator, fighting animals and sometimes human opponents. The crowd was expected to cheer wildly, though many spectators secretly feared his unpredictable temper. Under his rule, the games grew even more extravagant and even more violent. Executions became theatrical productions with elaborate costumes and sets. Entire mythological scenes were constructed inside the arena. Actors, musicians, and stage workers transformed the sand into a temporary theater of death. And once again, condemned women could become part of the spectacle. But there was another group that would soon face the arena's brutality in a different way. A new religious movement was spreading across the Roman Empire. Its followers worshipped a single god. They refused to honor the traditional Roman gods, and they refused to recognize the divine authority of the emperor. To Roman officials, this movement seemed dangerous. Those followers were known as Christians. During certain periods of Roman history, Christians were persecuted for their beliefs. Some were arrested, imprisoned, and eventually executed in public arenas. Among them were women who refused to renounce their faith. One of the most famous examples occurred in the early 3rd century during the reign of Septimius Severus. In the North African city of Carthage, a young noblewoman named Perpetua was arrested along with several other Christians. Perpetua was only 22 years old. She had a young child. Her family begged her to abandon her faith and save her life, but she refused. According to surviving records, Perpetua kept a diary describing her imprisonment and the events leading to her execution. Her account is one of the earliest known writings by a Christian woman. Eventually, she and her companions were sentenced to death in the arena. On the day of the execution, they were brought before a cheering crowd. Instead of gladiators, they faced wild animals released into the sand. Witnesses described how Perpetua remained calm even as the beasts attacked. Her courage stunned many spectators. The spectacle that was meant to terrify the population had instead created a powerful story of faith and resistance. And stories like this began to spread throughout the empire, because every execution in the arena carried an unintended consequence. People were watching, and sometimes the courage of the condemned made a deeper impression than the power of the empire. Slowly, attitudes began to shift. Philosophers, writers, and religious leaders started questioning whether such brutality truly reflected the greatness of Rome. Even some emperors began to feel uneasy about the games. By the 4th century, the Roman world was changing dramatically. Christianity was spreading rapidly across the empire. Political power was shifting. New cultural values were emerging. And the ancient traditions of the arena were beginning to face criticism from voices that had once remained silent. The spectacles that had entertained Rome for centuries were no longer universally accepted. But ending them would not happen overnight. The arena had become deeply embedded in Roman culture, and many citizens still demanded the thrill of the games. Yet history was moving in a new direction, a direction that would eventually bring the age of the arena to an end. But before that transformation could happen, the Roman world would experience one final era of spectacles, an era where the executions, the crowds, and the terrifying performances would reach their most dramatic and unforgettable form. Because the arena was not finished yet. By the late afternoon, the sunlight poured into the towering arches of the Colosseum, illuminating the arena floor where the sand had already absorbed the blood of the day's earlier spectacles. The crowd had not thinned. If anything, the excitement had grown stronger. Tens of thousands of Romans leaned forward in their seats, waiting for the next act of the games, because the final performances were always the most dramatic. By this point in the day, the audience had already seen exotic animals hunted, prisoners executed, and criminals punished. But the main event, the gladiatorial battles, was about to begin, and the executions that had taken place earlier, including those involving condemned women, had served a specific purpose. They prepared the crowd. Roman spectacles followed a carefully planned structure designed to build emotional intensity. Morning hunts displayed skill and bravery. Midday executions shocked and frightened the audience. By the time gladiators entered the arena in the afternoon, the crowd was already deeply engaged in the drama of life and death. The entire event was psychological theater, and the rulers of Rome understood exactly what they were doing, because the games were never just about entertainment. They were about power. Every cheer, every roar of excitement, every moment of suspense reminded the population who controlled the empire. The emperor provided the games. The emperor decided who lived and who died, and the emperor stood above the entire spectacle as the ultimate authority. Yet beneath the excitement of the crowd, something unexpected was beginning to happen in Roman society. People were starting to question the games. Not everyone, of course. Many Romans still loved the arena and considered it a proud tradition of their civilization. But among philosophers, religious thinkers, and some political leaders, doubts were growing. Was the empire becoming too cruel? Was the celebration of death damaging the moral fabric of Roman society? One of the strongest critics came from Christian writers who were witnessing the games firsthand. Among them was Tertullian, who described the arena as a place where human suffering had been transformed into public amusement. To Tertullian and others like him, the games represented a disturbing contradiction. Rome claimed to be the greatest civilization in the world, an empire of law, philosophy, architecture, and order. Yet it also gathered thousands of citizens to watch people die, and sometimes those victims were women. Stories about these executions spread far beyond the arena walls. Travelers carried the tales across the empire. Writers recorded shocking descriptions of mythological reenactments, animal attacks, and humiliating punishments. Gradually, these stories began shaping how future generations viewed the Roman games. But in the moment inside the arena, the spectacle continued, because the Roman world still believed in the power of the games. One emperor who fully embraced this belief was Diocletian. During his reign at the end of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire faced enormous challenges: economic instability, military threats, and political turmoil. Diocletian introduced sweeping reforms to stabilize the empire, but like many rulers before him, he also recognized the importance of public entertainment. The games continued under his rule, though the nature of Roman society was slowly evolving, and the most dramatic transformation was coming from an unexpected place: religion. During the early centuries of the empire, Christianity had been a small and often persecuted movement. Its followers were sometimes arrested and executed in arenas for refusing to honor the traditional Roman gods. But by the early 4th century, the situation had changed dramatically. A powerful new emperor rose to power, one who would alter the religious future of the empire. His name was Constantine the Great. Constantine's reign marked a turning point in Roman history. After winning a decisive civil war, he issued policies that granted legal recognition and protection to Christians. Suddenly, the religion that had once been persecuted was becoming influential within the imperial government, and with that influence came new questions about the morality of the arena. Christian leaders argued that public executions, gladiatorial combat, and violent spectacles were incompatible with their beliefs about mercy and human dignity. These arguments did not immediately end the games, but they began a slow cultural shift. Some emperors started limiting certain forms of execution. Others reduced the number of gladiatorial contests held in major cities. The transformation was gradual, For centuries, Roman culture had celebrated the arena. Ending that tradition required more than a single law or decree. It required a change in how people thought about violence, justice, and entertainment. And those changes were happening slowly across the empire. By the late 4th century, public attitudes toward the games were clearly shifting. One of the final dramatic moments in the history of gladiatorial combat occurred during the reign of Honorius. According to later historical accounts, a Christian monk named Telemachus once entered an arena during a gladiator fight and attempted to stop the combat. He reportedly stepped between the fighters, pleading for the violence to end. The crowd reacted with fury. Some spectators attacked him, killing him inside the arena. But the shocking incident had an unexpected consequence. When Emperor Honorius heard the story, he was reportedly so disturbed that he issued a decree banning gladiatorial combat in the Western Roman Empire. Whether every detail of the story is historically accurate remains debated among historians. But what is clear is that by the early 5th century, gladiatorial contests were rapidly disappearing from Roman society. The great arenas did not vanish overnight. They remained standing as architectural monuments, sometimes used for other forms of entertainment or public gatherings. But the age of gladiators, and the brutal spectacles that had once defined Roman entertainment, was coming to an end. The executions that had once thrilled enormous crowds gradually faded from public life. The empire itself was also changing. Political power was shifting away from the city of Rome toward new centers like Constantinople. The Western Roman Empire would eventually collapse in the 5th century, while the Eastern Empire continued for centuries more. But the memory of the arena never disappeared. Even today, the ruins of the Colosseum stand in the heart of Rome as one of the most recognizable landmarks in the world. Millions of visitors walk through its massive arches every year, marveling at the engineering skill and historical significance of the structure. Yet beneath that admiration lies a darker truth. The stones of the arena witnessed extraordinary cruelty. They witnessed people condemned to die for the entertainment of others. And among those victims were women whose stories were rarely recorded, whose names were often forgotten, but whose experiences reveal something profound about the nature of power in the ancient world. Because the Roman arena was more than a place of spectacle. It was a mirror, a reflection of a civilization that could produce breathtaking art, law, and architecture, while also embracing public violence as entertainment. The people who filled those seats were not monsters. They were citizens of one of history's most influential civilizations, but their culture had normalized a form of brutality that shocks modern audiences. And that contradiction is part of what makes the story of Rome so compelling. It reminds us that even the most advanced societies can struggle with the boundaries between justice, power, and cruelty. The empire that built roads across continents, created legal systems that still influence modern law, and constructed monuments that have survived for 2,000 years also created arenas where death became performance. And in those arenas, countless lives ended beneath the roar of the crowd. Their stories are echoes carried through history, echoes that still whisper through the ruins of Rome. Because long after the cheers faded and the empire itself disappeared, the lessons of the arena remained, a reminder that civilizations are defined not only by their greatest achievements, but also by the darkness they choose to accept.